Michael is going to talk to us tonight about PHP in 2017, so we look forward to that. Thanks, Michael.
Great, thanks. And thanks to Alan for spotting us on short notice. This was the first month that I didn't actually check with Nucleus that the date we wanted to use for the meetup, they would be available. So here we are, and good venue. It wasn't actually too bad. I hope no one had trouble getting on. I know some of you guys were already here, but yeah. So this is a talk that I finished preparing last night. I haven't actually run through all the way yet. It's just going to talk a little bit about where PHP is in 2017. I know a couple of you said that you've done a bit of work in Java and now you're coming into PHP or coming back to PHP. We've got people that have been using PHP for a number of years, people that are coming in new. So it's going to be fairly high level. I'm going to fly through a lot of different things. Because it's a high level, there is a few resources that I'll put up at the end of the presentation that you can go and learn more about. So the key thing now, especially in 2017, is to stay up to date. For a long time, development of PHP was very slow. So it's a lot quicker than what it used to be. Once upon a time, PHP 5 came out in July of 2004. 5.1 was November of 05. 5.2 was November of 06. Then there was a 3-year gap between 5.2 and 5.3. So HHVM, which was the hip-hop virtual machine, the hack language that Facebook was developing because they weren't seeing movement, they weren't seeing any progression with the PHP, really kicked PHP Group into gear. A lot of the underlying engine behind PHP, especially now in version 7, has been written, which makes it a lot quicker than what it used to be. Importantly to note, PHP 5 is end of life now. 5.6 is the last version, and it's not going to receive any updates beyond the end of next year. So a lot of operating systems, CentOS, Ubuntu, that have long-term support versions will actually backport security fixes in newer versions of PHP. So if you are stuck on one of those versions for whatever reason, you'll still get security fixes, but you're not going to be able to leverage any of the new features. So in 2011, the PHP Group came up with a proper release cycle so that they're always putting out new versions of PHP on a regular interval. So you basically get 3 years for each minor release, and each minor release, so 7.0, 7.1, 7.2, bring new features potentially. That's when those releases will be brought in, but during each minor release there'll be no new features. So it's patch releases only, fixing security issues. So they aim for at least one of those patch releases every month. They do a minor release at least once a year, and every one of those minor releases is then actively supported for 2 years. And then after that, you get 1 year of security and bug fixes. So a minor release of 7.1 will overlap in security, while 7.2 is out. So 7.2 is due out at the end of this year, and I don't know how well you can see that, but as you can see, 5.6 is end of life. Security fixes only until the end of next year. 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, wherever possible, it's time to start looking to migrate if you're still using older versions of PHP. So, as I said, this is going to be a very quick fly through of many different aspects around code, around groups, around things like that. So, a big part of modern PHP development was driven by the PHP Framework Interoperability Group, the FIG. Does anyone know who the FIG is? You know anything about the FIG? Does anyone know what a PSR is? No?
Wasn't there a big drama with the PHP guy?
There's lots of drama. There has been lots of drama with the FIG. A lot of it has settled down now, which kind of makes the group a little bit boring because some of that drama was pretty fun to get involved in, but I digress.
Are they part of the PHP?
They're not part of the PHP group itself. So the PHP group is largely under the Zend organization, which is owned by Rove. I think it's the Rove group, maybe. But the FIG is made up of members of different frameworks. So the members of Symfony, of Aura, of Laravel's not anymore. But that's primarily what it was. It was around discussing commonality between the projects so that sharing code was much easier between them, so that you can write something once and use it in Symfony or use it in Aura or use it in whatever framework you're choosing. So their main audience is each other. You know, they're trying to figure out how they can share their components with each other, but a lot of people in the wider community tend to adopt the decisions that are made by that group. So they discuss, they vote, and implement the PHP standard recommendations to the PSRs, which I mentioned earlier.
So is it fairly well? Is it fairly successful? Like, did they solve some of those incompatibility?
Yep, a lot of the initial stuff is these well-known recommendations around PSI 0, 1, 2, and 4.
And they're being implemented as well.
Yeah. So has anyone used Composer? Yeah. So the Composer is built on top of originally PSI 0, which was derived from Pair and the way that they loaded dependencies in projects. This then led to the PSR 4 autoloading standard. So wittingly or not, knowingly or not, a lot of you, if you've ever used Composer, you are using PSR 4. That is the common one. PSR 1 and 2, which are always fun, talk around coding standards and coding styles, so what the code looks like, how you would format your code, how you would write certain things. It is important to note that these are recommendations. Then you're not forced to follow them. However, if you are going to be doing any kind of interoperable code, if you're going to be sharing code, making packages, putting them up on GitHub, it makes it much easier for the open source community at large to basically work with that code, because it means that anyone can submit changes to or improvements or anything like that. So I mentioned the auto-loading standards. There are two. The first and the original one was PSI 0, which was based on the conventions used with Pair, which is kind of now defunct as a result. But this was used as a way to kind of mimic the lack of namespace support in PHP. So until PHP 5.3, there was no support for real sort of first-class object-oriented programming, and key to that was the namespacing. So what you would find, and this was going to be much better when Andrew was going to be here, but you would have everything would sit in one directory. It would be flat. It would be easy to have collisions, for example, but you'd have your top-level namespace, your package level namespace, and then your class name. And then you would separate those using underscores as a way of basically getting around the fact that there was no first-class namespace support in PHP. So yeah, as I said, in this convention, it was quite commonplace to put all of the vendor code in a single main directory. As a result of that, there was a lot of work done on it. The FIG was around. They were talking about these kind of things. Symfony and a couple of guys from that group came up with Composer, which is where we started looking towards auto-loading standard in PSR 4. So it meant there was no single global location, which doesn't really make sense because everything is within a vendor folder using Composer by default. And then you have your vendor level namespace, your package level namespace, and then all of your code. And with PSR 4, it allows you to basically map a namespace to a directory. So you wouldn't necessarily have Dyrynda package A class A within this directory, but it's easier to follow that convention. But this really heralded the arrival of Composer, and now each package is within its own separate directory under the vendor namespace. So you would have multiple packages released from a single vendor, for example. Symfony has many packages, Laravel has many packages, all separated under the same top-level namespace. And so yeah, each package must have at least a top-level vendor, followed by a package-level namespace, and then obviously the class name. So you'd have Dyrynda as the vendor, PHP Adelaide as the package, and then modern PHP as the class. On to the more controversial ones, PSR 1 and PSR 2. Has anyone seen Silicon Valley? Does this mean anything to anyone in the room, other than Jason? All right, so PSR 1 and PSR 2 cover many things about what code should look like. It's all about increasing operability. So it covers things about whether you should use full PHP open and close tags, or if you should use short tags. You should it defines whether you should be using tabs or spaces. Under PSR 2, it is spaces. So that's where this image comes from. If you haven't seen Silicon Valley, I do recommend it. It's a great look at our industry as a whole. Yeah. So she's spaces, he's tabs, and that basically ended their very short-lived relationship. No, he was wrong. Oh no, he was saying that she was wrong because she was using spaces. You'll note she is like frantically mashing the space bar. I think that was the most outrageous part of this thing, is that no one's actually going to sit there and hit space 4 times, okay? Your editor or your IDE is definitely going to be configured to handle that kind of stuff. Or you don't have to worry about whether the tabs or spaces. You don't have to worry about if the braces are on the start of the line or on the next line. The editor will do all of that for you. And you can even bring in things like PHP CS Fixer, which is a coding standards fixer, which you can just run over your code before you push it up. And that can all be part of your development workflow. But thanks to the FIG, there are currently 8 accepted, 1 deprecated, and 1 in review. So PSR 0 has been deprecated, it's been superseded by PSR 4. There is 1 currently in review, and there's, I think, another 8 that are in active discussion at the moment. So there's things around logging in there. There was one where a bunch of the FIG members were at a conference and they had a few drinks, and now there's a huggable interface, which is basically a standard recommendation around giving people hugs. So, like, literally giving them hugs. They're trying to kill it, but some of the bylaws don't make that a simple process, unfortunately. So, the language itself, it's flexible, it's dynamic, it lets developers write PHP in a number of different ways. Things like Java have a very specific set of conventions, it's strictly typed. Things like Ruby are very dynamically typed, there's duck typing, you can do all kinds of crazy things with it. Then you've got things like COBOL, which are very space specific. But the language itself has evolved quite dramatically. We first saw object-oriented programming support in PHP 5, which is 13 years ago now. We started to see things like anonymous functions, which allow you to do more functional concepts, which we'll talk about later on. And then namespaces were introduced as well with PHP 5.3, as we've discussed. And then traits were introduced in PHP 5.4 5 years ago now. So traits are reusable snippets. So instead of copying and pasting things around, you put them in a trait, and you can just import that trait into your classes and reuse them that way. So there are a number of different paradigms that PHP supports. Object-oriented programming. So it has got quite a rich object-oriented feature set. It has first-class support for classes, for interfaces, for single-class inheritance from multiple class inheritance, but only single interface. That's not true. Multiple interfaces, single class inheritance. So you can go down, but you can only inherit from one class. There's a lot of exceptions and things like that. Then we've got functional programming, which is, again, first-class support, and it means that you can pass functions to variables, you can return functions from methods, you can pass functions to other methods. Recursion is supported in PHP, but a lot of PHP development has an iterative focus, so you would loop over things, you would, for each, for, while, those kinds of things. And anonymous functions have been around since, as I said, PHP 5.4. Next, we've got metaprogramming, which supports crazy things like reflection. There are magic methods that you can use, which we'll go over in a moment as well. You don't have, you can use all of these, you can use none of these. It's entirely up to you. As I said, this is a dynamic language that you can write, whatever's comfortable. If you're coming from Java, it might be comfortable to feel that way, and so on. So object-oriented, who's done any object-oriented programming? Java developers, yep, cool, great. So this makes sense for most of you then. So you'd have a class is then going to define, in this instance, it's a very simple example. It's probably not a good example of object-oriented programming, but you would have a profile, which is your class. You would pass it into its constructor, a person's name, and their Twitter ID. Traditionally, you would make those variables private, or those properties on the class private, and then you would access them using getters, and you would optionally have setters as well, so you could change those values later. PHP is largely a mutable language, which means classes that you define and initialize and instantiate can change over their life, whereas an immutable construct, you would have, every time you make a change, it would give you a new instance of that class. In functional programming, as I said, you can pass functions to functions and return functions and things like that. These are, again, very contrived examples. Array map allows you to pass it an array, 1, 2, 3, and for each value in there, you would, multiply by 2, and then you would get 2, 4, 6 at the end of it. You could for each over it. This way basically allows you to do that assignment and iteration all in one step. Array filtering is handy as well if you want to get rid of empty values in this case. So loop through an array of strings and remove any that are empty strings. So return name. There's a reasonable segment of PHP that is doing this at the moment. It's useful in a lot of cases. It might go over your head in a lot of cases. It's certainly a different way of thinking about code. And then, as I said, we've got meta programming. So what this does, if we look at comparison to our object-oriented example before, rather than explicitly passing in a name and a Twitter handle, you would have these magic methods underscore get and set and to a string. And so basically, the getter, you pass it a key. PHP will translate this call, run it through here, and through this method. So it would see, does the key that you're asking for exist in the attributes array? If it does, it will return it. If not, it will return null. Likewise with setting, you would pass it a key and a value here. So totally arbitrary things you could pass into it. You could protect this method a little bit by saying these are the valid keys that you can pass in and throw some exception in there. And then this kind of stuff where you can call a class as a string kind of thing. So you could print that and you return a string representation of that class. So namespaces we touched on a little bit. And this allows the same class to exist multiple times in your project. So you could have a GitHub client and a Twitter client and an Instagram client. And as long as they all live in their own namespace, so you'd have, app, Twitter client, app GitHub client, app Instagram client, you can have 3 classes that all have that same name. So that's some of the flexibility that that is given to you with namespaces. It's also really useful in terms of sharing packages through Composer. It have been available since PHP 5.3, and they are the backbone of the PSI 4 autoloading standard, which we discussed. Does anyone know what the standard PHP library is? Great. All right, so the standard PHP library, or the SPL, are a collection of native classes and interfaces that you can use and extend in your own applications. It covers things like predefined constants, common data structures, and iterators to then traverse them. So you would have interfaces for iterators and exceptions, and things like SPL file info, so you can look at a file on your file system, you can get the metadata, you can get the file name, the extension, things like that. All right, dependency management. So circling back to the FIG, the main charter of the FIG is on interoperability of code. It's on sharing code between projects. It's their name. Code is distributed via packages, primarily on packages. So it's a website, it's a repository that you can search, you look for packages for code that other people have written. So they're installed by Composer, so that means we're not doing any more copy-paste from PHP classes or Stack Overflow or whatever it was that we were all copying and pasting from years and years ago. Many of us still do now. You have a problem, the first answer is usually Stack Overflow. You go, look, copy and paste it, figure out if it's going to solve your problem. But for larger things like libraries, Composer is certainly going to help you solve problems, pulling in, if you've got a project that you want to share, like a common API client, for example, that you've written for a service you've built, you'd write a package for that, you could publish it on packages, via Git, and then you can share that between any projects of yours that use it. Alternatively, you can hide it in your own private Git repositories, and Composer is very flexible in that regard. But Composer is specifically for managing dependencies and for configuring the auto-loading of those packages. So once you have Composer installed, which is a whole talk of its own for anyone who wants to talk at a future meetup, but basically you have a command line interface, Composer, require PSI Log. So we talked about PSI having a log recommendation, the Fig having a logging PSI. So you can pull that in, and what this will do is it will add the dependency to a composer.json file. So it will say, I want to use this package as a requirement for my project. And it will also add an entry to your composer.log file. So the .json file is for describing your project dependencies, and the log file is for installing them in a deterministic, reproducible way. If I install running a composer install, it's going to be the same as if Dallin does it, or if Jason does it, or if Damien does it. It's always going to install the exact same versions of the exact same dependencies. The only time that could become a problem is if you're installing those dependencies on different versions of PHP. If your composer.json file says, I need to have PHP 5.6, and Jason's running PHP 5.5, he's going to have some issues. But this will download and install the packages into vendor PSI log, and then it'll automatically set up an auto-loading file in vendor autoload.php, which you can then include in your project in some bootstrap process, and then you have access to whatever has been configured in there. This is out of left field, but date and time is hard. Has anyone had to deal with time and date in PHP? Or in any language, really? Yeah.
The date time class isn't too bad.
Yeah. So datetime makes things easier. There you go. Datetime and datetime immutable. Now, I talked briefly about immutable and mutable classes. Datetime is mutable. If you add days, or you manipulate a variable, an instance, of datetime, the next time you call it, it will have changed. Datetime immutable allows you to make that same manipulation, but it will return you a new instance of datetime. So that way, you can have, if you add something and then you want to do a comparison, if you use datetime, you're not going to be able to make a comparison because the two instances will be the same. And then you've got things like date time zone, date interval, and date period to complement them. So time zone, obviously, so you can initialize the date time in Adelaide or Sydney or Los Angeles or London. Date interval and date period go hand in hand, and they're more around adding time, subtracting time, and those kind of operations. Does anyone know what carbon is? You knew what datetime was.
I've seen carbon, I haven't played with it.
All right, cool. So as that much easier that datetime makes working with dates in PHP, carbon makes things easier again. You've got terse method names, it's readable, it makes sense to look at it. So we'll look here. If you were to use datetime to get the current time and add 1 day, and then format it into a year, month, date timestamp, you've got 3 lines. You can condense it down, into this kind of horrible looking thing. You can leave out date, time zone, and now. They are the defaults. This will use your PHP configurations default time zone. The first parameter is always going to be the current time, so always now. Pass in a string or some other thing that datetime can parse for you. And then, as I said, carbon just makes that more readable. Give me now in this time zone, add 1 day to it, and then format it.
I think that second one would be a parse error in some older versions. Trying to.
It would be, because you can't do this operation where you're assigning and then returning, instantiating and then returning date time. So I think PHP, 5.4 will probably get a bit cranky with you, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we're talking, modern PHP. You can see how much things you can do now that, as Damien points out, you couldn't do, 5 or 6 years ago. We're going to talk about a few common design patterns. There are many. There are people will drone on and on you about different design patterns. I will only take a small fraction of your time to drone about these. But we have factories. If you're using a framework, a lot of the high-level design of your application will be driven by the conventions used by the framework. So Laravel has a very specific way of writing code. Symfony has a specific way. Cake, CodeIgniter, all these different frameworks will all have a specific way. And it helps for different developers coming into your project and being able to go, all right, I know how to write a CodeIgniter app, or I know how to write a Symfony app, and they can come in and you can get any Symfony developer or any CodeIgniter developer to come and look at that. If you follow the conventions that are set out for you by the frameworks, it makes your life easier in getting help, in getting other developers and so on. And you know, if for whatever reason you move on from a business, the next person that comes in is not going to have any issues. So yeah, so we've got factories, which is using name constructors to create an object you want. So rather than doing that new date time, can we go back? Yeah. So rather than doing new date time, you would have Carbon Now, which is a factory which will do basically the same operation. Carbon is a wrapper over date time. So Carbon actually extends the underlying datetime class and then performs all of its operations using that. The other thing that we have are singletons, which basically make sure that you get the exact same instance of a class every time you ask for it during a request cycle. So if you say, you know, I want a session or a log, generally you want the exact same instance of the session store or the logging interface every time you ask for it in your application. You don't need to go and take up more memory in your application to get a whole new instance of that class. So singletons are useful in those cases. Strategy is common in that you may have used it and not know what it is, but it's useful for basically encapsulating common families of functionality, but separating the knowledge of how those things are implemented from what's calling it. So you would pass in an interface and say, I need something that implements this interface, and you know that some method will exist on it. So a very simple example is to define an output interface. So you could say, I need like an output method on this thing, and what is calling that class doesn't care how it's implemented. It just wants to be able to say output. I will give you some data and you should output it. And you could have a JSON representation, or you could have a CSV or an array or a string or whatever. The strategy would be responsible for how that happens. All you care is that it does happen. Anyone that's used Laravel, Symfony, would maybe indirectly be familiar with the concept of a front controller. So you'd have a single index.php file, and all of your requests, all of your application requests would go through that front controller, and it will be responsible for booting the application, for saying the request to this route needs to go to that controller, and so on and so forth. So it's basically responsible for dispatching all the routes. And the last one, which goes hand in hand a lot of the times with the front controller, is the model view controller, which helps you break up the models, which is all of your data access, your views, which could be JSON or it could be HTML or whatever else, and then the controllers which handle the request coming in, processing the data returned from any of your models, and then spitting back the response. Have I lost anyone yet? Because we're about to go deeper. All right, who knows what dependency injection is? Java man? No? No? All right. This dependency injection is a software design pattern that allows the removal of hard-coded dependencies and makes it possible to change them, whether at runtime or compile time. It's not as complicated as that description sounds. So dependency injection is basically a fancy way of saying that the class dependencies are injected into the class's constructor rather than being instantiated inside the class. So I know a few of you have used Laravel, and Laravel is basically built entirely around dependency injection. It is one of the core tenets of Laravel. So without dependency injection, you would have this private property for a user repository, which is for accessing or abstracting access to your database, and you would new it up inside your controller. It's a fairly common approach for simple things. It works fine, but with dependency injection, you would shift that assignment. So instead of newing up the user repository here, you would pass it in to your class constructor, and then generally your framework or your dependency injection container would be responsible for resolving this user repository into something that your application is going to use. A lot of the times this is going to be an interface, and you would define what should be returned from the container when that interface is asked for. But it is a very subtle difference. We're basically moving this up one line into your constructor. You can go a bit overboard. I know when Magento went to version 2, they had 30, 40 lines of this. So, and that's a topic for another day. Where are we? So yeah, this basically serves to decouple your controllers from knowing what the dependencies are. So it's powerful because you can bind complex things. This user repository could be something that talks to a remote API, and that remote API requires a key. So when you bind the implementation into the container, you would say, anytime I ask for the user repository, which is an interface, I also need to instantiate that class with the API key, which you can pull out of the environment or some other configuration file. So that's really handy in those instances, but it's also really nice to be able to look at the constructor, which is often the very first thing in your classes, and you can see, all right, I need this and this and this and this. Okay, databases. Who's on PHP 7? All right, 5.6? Yeah, 5.5? 5.4? 5.3? Okay, so we're all reasonable. Wait, 5.2? 5.1? No? All right. So we're all reasonably up to date. MySQL Connect, MySQL Query. MySQL is deprecated in PHP 5.5, okay, and it has been removed in PHP 7, so you can't use this anymore. But you shouldn't. It hasn't been developed for years. Even if you're on PHP 5, please do whatever you can to move to MySQLite. It's going to make your upgrade path to PHP 7 a lot easier. A lot of our applications are on the web. A lot of our applications are dealing with databases. That is going to be the biggest roadblock for a lot of people in getting from PHP 5 to PHP 7. There are legacy reasons. There are other interesting things that worked in earlier versions of PHP. They're a bit more loosey-goosey. So MySQLi, it's very cleverly named. It's MySQL Improved. It's a reasonably simple, I say simple, it's not easy, but it's a reasonably simple transition from MySQL. The one thing, I don't know if this happened at NewScope, the one thing that they did was they switched the order of arguments into like MySQL query from query and then the optional link to you must provide the link, which is the database connection, and then the query. So in here you would put query and then you would just assume that you're using whatever MySQL Connect has done. In MySQLi, you would have to say, use this connection to make this query. So that is the main gotcha, and it's not a simple string replace. You've got to look at that into a little bit more detail. And then we have PDO, which is a common interface for different persistence layers. So you can use PDO to access Postgres or MySQL or MySQL MariaDB, are more or less the same thing, or SQLite. It will not translate your queries. There are things that work in MySQL that don't work in SQLite. There are things that work in SQLite that don't work in MySQL. And this is where framework and abstractions come into it. Things like Doctrine, which is a data mapper, things like Active Record, which is a pattern that is really heavily used in the Ruby community in Rails. It's the backbone of a lot of Laravel applications. These things are abstractions that extend from PDO and will handle writing the queries for you. So with Active Record, you could do something like user all, and it would be responsible for then translating user : all into select star from users. So it will handle that, and it means that it's much easier to say use SQLite in your testing environment, MySQL or Postgres in your production environments. Okay, we'll come up the stack a little bit to templating. PHP is a templating language. That is what it started out as. But no buts yet. Templates are a convenient way for separating your controller, your domain, and your presentation logic. So coming back to model view controller again. It gives you a clear separation between the presentation and the rest of your app. Whilst it is basically just PHP, try not to do crazy control structures or try not to sneak database queries into there. It's not what the view layer is for. But it does help to improve the organization of your presentation code by usually putting all of your views inside a views folder. You could namespace things in there, not in the namespace way that we were talking about before, but say, you have views, users, views, blog posts, or whatever else. It is a natural choice for a lot of people, especially if you're new to the language. You already know PHP, you don't want to start throwing other things on top of it. It's very easy to intermingle PHP, but try not to do too much in there. It's not what they're for. You don't have to learn anything new. You know PHP, you know how to use PHP as templating. Beware of escaping issues and never trust your user input. It's going to be a death throw. If someone puts some JavaScript into their user biography, well, you're going to get pop-up for everyone who looks at your biography, right? This is the kind of thing that if you're using plain PHP, you're not protected with. There are tools, certainly the HTML special characters, for example, to save yourself. So this will just render as this. The browser will interpret that as characters. This will give you, as I said, a pop-up on your screen. So things like that. There's a contrived example. There are worse things that can happen, but something to certainly be mindful of if you're using PHP for templating. We then have compile templating. So PHP has improved as a language itself, but not so much in regards to templating. PHP is still just PHP. But there are compiled options like Twig and Smarty. Smarty was, for a long time, an official sort of PHP project. I don't know if it is anymore, and I don't know how actively developed it is these days, but it gives you new syntax specific to templating. So it's something new to learn. Twig uses % signs to denote control structures like if statements and things like that. Smarty uses, I think, curly braces from memory. Jason, do you remember? No? Curly braces? Yep. But it does give you things like automatic escaping, it gives you inheritance, so you can include templates, you can break out things that you use across your project, you can put it into its own template, pull in like a user profile and have that in its own template and use it in a blog post or in a list of users on your site or whatever. And it does simplify control structures a little bit for you as well. If you do look at Smarty, I believe automatic escaping is not enabled by default, but it's just a config switch. But they're designed to be easier to write, they're cleaner to read, they're safer to use. When I say safe as in it escapes, so you don't have those issues with JavaScript pop-ups and nefarious users. Many frameworks have their own flavor. There's Aura View for the Aura framework, there's Blade, Twig is used a lot in Symphony Land. Who has errors in their PHP applications? All right. PHP has been for a long time and typically exception light. Okay, so you get an error on your screen, that white screen that says PHP notice, PHP warning, whatever. It doesn't stop the code from executing unless you get a fatal error. So something's gone really wrong. So you get these ugly errors that present to your users. So there are several severity levels. You got errors, notices, warnings, info, fatal. There are also things like eStrict and eDeprecated. If you turn these things on in PHP 5.5, 5.6, it will point out, it will scream at you and say, hey, you're using MySQL, it's time to move on. This is the official way for PHP to say, hey, this feature is being removed in a future version, you should do something about it. It will tell you, or it gives you at least an error message to look forward. But as I said, they're there to help you with future compatibility. This thing is changing, it's going away, it's not supported anymore. You should do something about it if you want to keep updating your applications. You can change error behavior. You can override which errors PHP displays, which is useful in production. You don't necessarily want your users to see errors, but you do want to log them somewhere. So you want to override the display of those errors, but you still want to catch them and then log them into a file somewhere. You can suppress errors in line. Note when you do this, PHP's error control operator will completely swallow this error. It's not logged, it's not displayed anywhere, it's just gone. So if you're going to do that, make sure you know what you're doing, because if you can avoid using the suppression operator, you should definitely consider it. All right, try not to do this. In PHP, 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, you can use this ternary operator, which is a bit ugly. You can go, if this value is set, then display foobar, otherwise show an empty string. PHP 7, we've got this null coalesce operator, which basically condenses that down. If, same thing. Yeah, please don't do that if you can avoid it. There are certain times where you can do it. If you're deleting a file from the file system and you don't know if the file's there, or maybe the permissions change, things can happen behind the scenes if you're dealing with files. You can use the @ symbol when you unlink the file. That way, you delete the record, but if the file is not there or you don't have permission to it, get rid of it. It is default practice in Symfony and Laravel to translate any PHP errors of any level into error exceptions. So if you've done any work in Symfony or Laravel, you will have seen this page. This only appears in debug mode, in development. If you have this enabled in production, you're going to start leaking things about paths and potentially usernames and secrets and things like that. So make sure that you don't have debug mode enabled in production. And then we talked about errors. The next thing is exceptions. And exceptions are typically caught during development. The exceptions are there for developers. They're not there for users. But you can catch the exceptions and act on them in a user-friendly way. So they're common in a lot of popular languages. They're often overlooked in PHP because for a long time we didn't have them. But errors make it impossible for anybody to handle them. You can't really do anything with it. You can log it in a file, but you can't say, I'll catch this notice and send the user away. So yeah, as I said, the exceptions ought to be thrown to make developers aware of an error. This will happen in development. You can see the error. You can catch it in your unit tests, for example. Going back to the SPL, there are a number of different exceptions available in PHP. They all extend from a base exception class. I think it's changed in PHP 7.1. It might be an error exception or something now, but everything is now essentially an exception. There are many specific ones. You can use invalid argument exception if you're doing some validation. A user has given you some rubbish input. Logic exceptions, runtime exceptions, things that happen during run that you weren't expecting to happen. There is a lot of them. You can extend from them. A common practice that I've used, a common practice that I do use is to basically have really terse names for exceptions that happen in my applications. So I might have a generic exception class that extends from invalid argument exception, and then I would have a named method called user supplied invalid email address, and then I would pass it some things and use that to then format the exception and then call that directly. So you can throw those things, and it makes it easy for anyone who's reading your code to get a good idea of what has actually gone wrong and what they should do about it, rather than a generic unhandled exception has occurred or whatever. These old Windows error messages. So who deals with passwords in their applications? Everyone? I know Bill is looking at doing it. This one's for you, Bill. Don't roll your own passwords. Do not, under any circumstances, roll your own password as security. As smart as anyone in this room is, or as smart as all of us in this room combined are, there are people whose job is just on hashing of strings of passwords, of protecting your users, of protecting user data, of protecting your applications. Luckily, we don't have to worry about it too much anymore. But don't use MD5, don't use SHA-1. They are reproducible, they're susceptible to collisions. SHA-1 was recently determined by Google. They're doing some big computational experiment that given two different sets of data, they were actually able to produce the same hash for SHA-1. There are things called rainbow tables where you can basically generate massive sets of data that say, for any given set of characters, you can then compute what the hash is and then reverse engineer it. They're great for things like determining if a file is exactly what you're expecting it to be. A lot of when you download a binary, you get like a little SHA sum. You can make sure that what you download is what you're expecting, so you're not getting any files that you weren't expecting. It's good for unique naming and things like that, as long as you don't care about doesn't matter if someone figures out what the original name of a file was that was uploaded to your application, for example.
Okay, as long as you do expect an adversary to expend a substantial amount of computational power to do something.
That's right.
Hashing, like as in hash maps, is fine.
Yeah.
You should probably be prepared to rely on SHAS for verifying files.
Yep.
You probably shouldn't be doing it anymore now.
Yeah.
But they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can use MD5 or SHA-1 over a string, over a file name, and then say, all right, I'm going to put that there. You can also use SHA-1. There are separate, I know there's definitely an MD5_file function that you can run over a file and compute its MD5 sum. I wouldn't recommend doing it in the request lifecycle. They're kind of slow. You don't want to hold users up while you're generating the hash for a file. But luckily for us, passwords are automatically salted since PHP 7, which is basically just adding a random string to each password before hashing using built-in functions. And it means that no two passwords, even if they're their exact same, if I hash the same string twice, you're going to get a different value each time, or 3 times, or 4 times. It's always going to be different. So these functions have been available since PHP 5.5. I think there is a compatibility layer that gives you access to these in 5.3 and 5.4 as well. Basically, password hash, the string, password default is currently using bcrypt, which is the the strongest algorithm that PHP currently supports. It's best to use password default because when bcrypt 2 comes out, or whatever, ccrypt, or whatever the next thing is, this will automatically change and it will ensure forward compatibility. If you specifically say you want to use bcrypt, well, you're always going to have to use bcrypt. If you want to change it, you're going to have to go and change it wherever you've used it. Usually it's okay because you're only verifying passwords in one place in your application when someone logs in. So yeah, you would take the user's input, you would run it through password hash, you would generate that hash, and then you would compare it using password verify with that same string. So the string wouldn't change when you've logged in, but it's saying, forgetful is obviously going to be different to the hash generated for secret. I don't know how this stuff works under the hood. That's the point. You don't need to know. If you want to, you can go digging, right? PHP does this for you. Use it. Get on to the rest of your application. There is a mechanism that exists to determine if a hashed value needs to be rehashed. If we go from bcrypt to ccrypt and you're using password default, you can put this inside your password verification method and check, do I need to rehash this password because we're using a different hashing algorithm? If so, generate the new hash, throw it in your database, log the user in. The next time they log in, we'll be doing the comparison with the new hash. So yeah, it's useful when the time comes to upgrade the algorithm or the hashing options change. So you can, this options is optional, but you can pass in a different number of rounds. So you could do 20 rounds or 30 rounds or 100 rounds when you're generating that hash. Last one, I'm pretty sure, is filtering. Never trust foreign content ever. Don't trust your users. Don't trust uploads. Don't trust anything. Right? You want to keep the integrity of your application safe. Dallin would know this, given that he's working with bank details. Never trust your users. Get, post, server. These super globals can be user manipulated. Get comes in the URL. Right? Anyone can change that. They can see it. They can go, password's there, I'll change it to something. Or user ID, I can change it to something else. Never trust it. Always validate it. Post, same thing. Server's a little bit trickier, but it can still be done. Files, sessions, cookies, they're all foreign content. They can all be manipulated by nefarious users. PHP offers filter var and filter input, which can be used for filtering incoming data. And they come with a whole lot of different things. You can filter for valid email addresses, you can filter for valid URLs, filter for integers and things like that. PHP docs. We talk about Java, we talk about Ruby, we talk about PHP, Python. PHP probably has some of the most comprehensive documentation of most programming languages. I know the Java docs are pretty good, but the PHP docs are also largely have a lot of user contributions. So there's a lot of examples in there on how to use things if the documentation isn't clear. You should always filter all of your input, and you should always sanitize your output. Okay, so make sure that you're not getting dirty data in. Make sure you're not spitting out JavaScript alerts when you present your data. Frameworks will usually handle all this for you. Okay, Laravel has validation baked in. You can give it your input, you give it an array of rules, and it will handle that for you. Symfony is the same. Other frameworks will be the same. I was right. That was the end of it. Thank you very much to Josh Lockhart, who authored this book, Modern PHP, and together with Phil Sturgeon subsequently built PHP the Right Way. It is available as a free ebook. It's also available at phptherightway.com. They're both a very in-depth and comprehensive look at modern PHP development. This is updated. Obviously, this is a physical book, so it's harder to update. This is user contributed. Examples are updated. It's up to date with PHP 7 and when 7.1 came out and 7.2 comes out. If anything changes, that's a great place to look back to. It is where a lot of the content in this presentation came from. There is a lot more in that than what I covered. I mean, you've listened to enough of my voice, I think. So, thank you very much. I am shamelessly self-promoting. I'm on Twitter. I have a podcast. In fact, that's not true. I have 2 podcasts. So if you haven't had enough of my voice and you want to listen on an alternating weekly schedule, North meets South, we just talk about what we worked on during the week, challenges we overcame, things like that in a modern world. We had some really good discussions about Docker recently, if anyone's interested in that. And a Laravel News podcast. We talk about the news in the Laravel community. We're running a series at the moment with speakers that are going to be at Laracon US. So if you have any interest in that, you can subscribe in your podcatchers of choice if you listen to podcasts. That is it. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Did I totally fry everyone's brains? You don't have to ask me questions about what I spoke about. If you've got questions about modern PHP in general, I will do my best to answer them.
I'm glad you appended modern PHP in general, otherwise you would have gotten the duck-sized horse-sized ducks question.
Something I'm very used to in the Java world is you can have the same method name with different parameters that PHP doesn't seem to support.
Doesn't, yeah.
Is that coming, or is that something? Sorry?
I've had the loading functions.
Yeah.
There's a name for it. I forget what it's called. But I know what you're talking about. PHP doesn't.
No.
It doesn't support.
has that as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. It's the same.
A lot of other languages have it, except PHP.
Yeah, well, I mean, PHP is really dynamic, so it's kind of interesting that it isn't supported. But
But you can omit if you have default value for the parameter, you can omit in the call.
yeah,
Just kind of anytime.
yeah, and
I'll just say, a lot of the time you don't have to, if you're doing that, that's fine, but then you have to check is something set, whereas if you're doing it as part of a named method with different parameters, you know whether it's there or not.
there is some dynamic ways of getting around it. You can there is a PHP native function called func get args, and there's also I think func num args. So you can do a check. Did I get one parameter? Follow this code path and defer to another private method or whatever. If there was 2, if there was 3, have a look at the Laravel code base. It does it a lot in terms of did I get this thing? Go and do that. Did I get an array? Did I get a string? Convert the string to an array. There are ways around it, yeah. But to your point, no, it's not available in PHP.
Write yourself.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
And the other thing is you can now, but in the past you could never enforce a certain type to be passed in as a parameter. So if you're calling the same function with 2 different, you can't do that like in Java where you say this is the function with an int and this is the function with a string. PHP didn't have a way to enforce that.
I think that's probably where this all stems from, is there wasn't a very defined typecasting.
So we have strict types now. PHP 7, PHP type hinting has been around. We talked about this the other day. I think since 5.4, you could do basic scalars like arrays and objects. You can now, as of PHP 7, do strings, integers, things like that. PHP 7.1 introduced the ability to have nullable, so you can have you can type in a specific class or an array or whatever, but you couldn't also then say it can be null. PHP would blow up. In 7.1, you can like prefix it with a question mark now, and it'll go, you can have this or null. So PHP is certainly, it's still a dynamic language at heart. It's becoming more strict if you want it to be. You can do return type hints now as well, but you have to define, and it's per file. You can't say for this project I want it to enable strict mode. It's like at the top of every file, declare strict equals 1 or whatever the annotation is.
What's your experience of going to 7.1? Do you normally, if you're on Linux, compile it yourself, or do you use a package? Or?
No, we do everything out of SPL. What's it called? SCL. So we use CentOS at work. So everything is CentOS. It's all compiled. So we just install packages.
Is there actually does CentOS ship a package for 7? PHP 7?
Yeah. So that's using SCL. So that's.
Well, that's an extra package.
Repository package.
Yep.
To install PHP 7 or whatever.
Yeah. So SCL is software collections.
Right.
And it's like a maintained set of like more up to date. So CentOS will ship with its default packages, which are going to be locked to a certain version because they have long-term support agreements. So they'll backport any fixes into whatever the current supported version is. But if you want the next minor version, so if you want to go to 7.1, you've got to basically upgrade your OS, unless using software collections. So we're running, I think, CentOS 7 in our production environment, but with software collections, it means that we're not using the default 5.6. We can install 7.1. So we've just gone to 7 in production.
It's pretty stable because sometimes it
Yep.
dependency. All right.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a consideration as well.
Was it pretty simple to upgrade your code, or is it pretty much backward compatible?
Any code that you've written in a reasonably up-to-date way from PHP 5.5 will lift and shift pretty easily to PHP 7. Anything.
Reviewing your deprecated warnings.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. There is the PHP website has got guides, and it tells you these things won't work if you upgrade to PHP 7. So
change logs are pretty good with backwards compatible changes, and this will break and this is different.
Mm-hmm.
It gets into quite a lot of detail.
Yeah.
What about performance? Is it really 2 times faster than 5.6?
Yep. So PHP 5.6, as I said, HHVM really kicked the development of PHP into gear. 5.6 was miles faster than 5.5. PHP 7 was miles faster again. It's 50%, it's twice as fast, not 50% fastness. 7 is twice as fast. 7.1 is faster again, but I think we found that 7.1 tends to use a bit more memory than what 7 does. So 7 is probably a sweet spot for now. I know there's a lot of work going on around JIT compilers and stuff for PHP 7, which they kind of got closer to and then scrapped a little bit. So there's a few podcasts out there with Zev Sarasky, who's the Zen guy, and the father of one of the fathers of PHP, where he talks a lot about that kind of stuff. But yeah, it is a lot quicker. You might have had things like Varnish and that sitting in front of your applications on 5.6. With PHP 7. It ships with opcache by default. That's all enabled. You can configure it to different degrees for different environments, which generally you want to do, but it is much faster in most real world cases. Yeah, I was looking as part of preparation for this talk. There is, I think on the Zen website, there's like a massive one of those. It's got all pictures and stuff. It's got graphs on there that shows we're serving twice as many requests with half as many resources for like WordPress and Drupal and Symfony and things like that. So yeah. Anyone using Laravel or anyone using Symfony, the next version that comes out in June, July will be PHP 7 and above. So, if that's something that you're doing, then, the bigger sort of organisations and communities are starting to really push this forward so that we can keep up to date.
Will be PHP 7 only, or will be PHP 7 compatible?
PHP 7 minimum.
Right.
Yeah. So if you need to stick with 5.6, you're gonna have to stay on 5.4.
Most of the major ones now work at least on PHP 7. Like WordPress works on PHP 7.
Yep, WordPress works on 7 and 7.1 as well. I know there was a little bit of overlap in 7.1. Yeah. Yeah, I was using the 7.1. It was just some weird things that Sam was doing that didn't work. So yeah, for most of the major projects now, especially Drupal 8, which is largely built on Symfony components now as well, WordPress, they'll happily work on PHP 7 and have done for, well, at least a year, I guess. But yeah, certainly, things like, WordPress still says that their minimum version is 5.3. So, but there's a lot of that is due to backwards compatibility. They're, trying to keep a whole lot of users working on, up-to-date versions of WordPress, security fixes and things like that. But they need to do that they need to be mindful of users that are still on 5.3 and 5.4 and whatever else. But so they don't take advantage of PHP 7 specific features. There's no null coalesce operators or things like that. No return type ins. But yeah, certainly, it does run quite well on PHP 7.
Is hip-hop still going? Is that still maintained, or are they abandoned it?
Yeah, I think it's still going. A lot of projects are sort of like. Yeah. I think a lot of projects sort of dropping their official support for it. I'm like, I know Laravel specifically said, if it works, but we're not saying it's officially supported anymore. As I said, that was the catalyst for a lot of PHP 5.6 for 7. So a lot of the work that went into that basically meant that you don't need to use Hack if you needed that performance, basically. There are different language features and constructs that Hack has that PHP 7 doesn't, for example, and they're design decisions by Facebook, basically, because they're things that they needed. They wanted PHP, but they wanted PHP and these things. So largely performance for PHP 7, and we're getting new features. And now that PHP is on a regular release cycle, and we're getting new things all the time. If you ever want to fall into the deep dark hole that is the PHP internals mailing list, you will learn some things, both about the language and about the people that are writing it. Huh? All good? Great.